Okay, shall we get started? Welcome to part five of this year's BGA FRTOL course. This evening, Chula's going to be doing most of the work. Well done, Chula. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Before we start, a couple of parish notices. Coaches, remember you need a star in front of your name if I'm to sort you out into the right breakout groups. And we had a couple of questions that I've just had an email from Carol Marshall about. And she asks two things. One is a question about the scripts that we had last week. And she's asking about the position of the call sign for the glider. So what we said was when Cambridge Airport was in sight, and remember that the motor glider had been asked to report when the aerodrome was in sight. So when the aerodrome is in sight, the motor glider says Golf Kilo Sierra aerodrome in sight. And then later, when in the circuit, it says Golf Kilo Sierra dead side descending. And she asked whether those call signs ought to be on the back of the phrases. And my answer is no, they're in the right place. They're on the front because it's new information you're giving. When you're responding to something that air traffic has said, repeating it back, making sure that you've got it right, or acknowledging with a Roger, then the call sign goes on the back. But when you're providing new information, so there's been a silence for a while and you're saying something new that's happened to you or a request or something, you start that with your call sign. So that's that rule. The second question is about transponder codes and the conspicuity code. And a couple of years ago, the CAA decided to have two conspicuity codes, 7,000 for VFR flight and 2,000 for IFR flight. And Carol asks, let me see. She asks, if a glider is flying above 3,000 feet and is 200 feet below cloud, should the squawk be 2,000, that is an IMC squawk, or 7,000, that is a VFR squawk? I presume she says that it should be 2,000, so generally when flying above altitude 3,000, the squawk should be 2,000. Is this the same for power? And strictly, the answer is if you're flying IFR, I think is it an IMC squawk or an IFR squawk? I think it's an IFR squawk. Chris is saying yes, it's an IFR squawk. Strictly, if you're going to fly technical IMC, you cannot fly VFR. The visual flight rules have to be in visual meteorological conditions. But you can fly instrument flight rules either in visual meteorological conditions or instrument meteorological conditions. And as gliders, we fly IMC, instrument meteorological conditions, when we get close to cloud, particularly above 3,000 feet, because that isn't VFR. And that's true for us in power. The difference is that we don't need an instrument qualification to do that. So strictly, in those circumstances, you ought to have 2,000 set. You can have 2,000 set for the time you're under 3,000 feet as well. That's fine. What you're telling the controller is that you might be close to cloud at times, and you can't rely on that separation, or they can't rely on that separation. In reality, does it make much difference? Probably not. But strictly, Carol, yes, you're right. With the addition that you don't have to keep swapping as you go above and below 3,000 feet. You could just leave it on 2,000. If you then, though, wanted to go do a Class D crossing or something like that, you'd probably get on a lot better if you switched back to 7,000 and said you wanted a VFR crossing. So there you go. Happy to expand on that some more if anybody wants. In the absence of any other immediate questions, let me just check the chat. Nope. I'm going to pass over to Chula.
Thanks, Paul. And I don't know if everyone's been muted or not, but perhaps
No, I'll do that
and I'll
now.
unmute.
But I'm about to mute you, Chula, so you'll have to unmute.
Great. Thank you very much. So good evening, everyone. I've been playing with the technology, so I'm going to launch a poll. Let's see how that goes.
That has worked for me.
It does it?
It does.
Cool. So question number one then, the second element of the Mayday call. So the first element is Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. What's the next thing that you should say? And of course, this is from the standard format, which if you don't know, then you will know if you're going to be doing the exam. So currently we've got 69% saying it's the call sign of the station you're calling, 26% say the aircraft call sign. And let's see what answers are coming up for question two. The transponder code associated with Mayday, what is that? And 4% say 7,000. Perhaps that's just because Paul, oh no, Paul wasn't talking about that, was he? No. Or was he? Yes, I think he was just. And almost everyone is giving the 7700 answer. Send the poll, I'll share the results. Someone tell me if the results coming up or give me a thumb up.
Yeah, firm results are here.
Super. So it is the call sign of the station that you're calling. That is the right answer. And a good majority got that right. And almost everyone, oh no, what have people said? Oh, 77, yeah. Sorry, almost everyone's got that right at 94%. Great. So people have been doing the reading. Fabulous. See if I can manage the next bit of technology and share a screen.
That looks good, Tulip.
Super. Thank you. So tonight then, we'll be dealing with emergencies, obviously, and we'll consider whether it's a Mayday or a PAN call. We'll be talking about the distress and diversion cell down at Sonic, D&D, talking about how you can practice with D&D. We'll return to one of the poll subjects there, some of the emergency transponder codes. And fifthly, VHF direction finding, VDF. And finally, we'll do coaching as we normally do. Questions to Paul, coaches, don't forget to put a star in front of your name. So, distress calls. Mayday 3 times, followed by, as you now know if you didn't, the station that you're calling. So, this is if you or somebody else, so again, you or somebody else needs assistance. And the idea in your head here, or in our heads here, is that this is a serious matter. There's a serious threat. It's dangerous, and it's imminent. That's the concept. So if you saw this scene of a midair and somebody jumped out, that's a Mayday call. If you thought you were about to have to jump out because of control flutter, then, well, I'm sure you'd jump out first, but just to state the point that that's clearly very serious, and that would be Mayday. As opposed to the urgency call. So 2 types of emergency call, distress and urgency. Urgency call, pan, 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 pan. And this deals with the safety of an aircraft or vehicle that does not require immediate assistance. So let's say you were lost and you thought you were flying towards controlled airspace. That would be a pan call. If you were feeling unwell and wanted to divert somewhere unexpected, perhaps that's a pan call. Now, having tried to distinguish those two things, and we should try and get it right, whether it is Mayday or PAN is of secondary importance. The important thing is to communicate the required information. And in the test, it will be obvious which it is. And if it's not obvious, because it's a practical sort of question put up by the examiner, then I'm sure latitude will be given. In real life, IRL, we're not, as Paul said last week, I think, no one is going to use the full IKO format. So for the exam, and your own sense of professionalism and perfection, you want to know the format, like the other 5 formats. You ought to be able to write them down, and you ought to be able to apply them. Don't go into the exam not knowing those formats and not being able to apply them. But in real life, convey the fundamentals of the situation. And then only after you've aviated. So no amount of talking on the radio is really going to help you if you have a crisis. So fly the aeroplane first. If time permits and it's the appropriate thing to do, then transmit your Mayday call. And you will probably keep it to something like the call sign and type, so Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta PA 28 or glider 123. What's wrong, the nature of the emergency and your intentions, what you're going to do about it. And if you're going to land somewhere unexpected, then don't forget to say where you're going to land. I've noticed in many of the practice sessions when we're doing these courses, people might well say Mayday, 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 London Centre, Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, C152, engine failure, and then they go on and don't say where they're going to land. And actually, that's the only point of that call, really, to know where to send the ambulance. So don't forget to say where you're going to go. And so position and level might also be relevant. So that would be my abbreviated suggestion for an in real life case. If you're considering talking on the radio at all times, you should be aware of this hierarchy of importance given to messages. So I'll put this slide here because it's the sort of thing that an examiner might ask somebody. Is a meteorological message before or after a safety message? So you should know that sequence. I think they all probably speak for themselves, except flight regulatory, which might be something like the sequence of airplanes coming back to an airport, or it might be something to do with maintenance. So that would be the best understanding I'd give you for number 6. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but just if you didn't know, then there is a sequence or a hierarchy of who gets priority of the airwaves. If you hear an emergency call, then you should keep quiet because the emergency call has priority. Keep quiet. Listen to the details because the relevant authority controller may not hear everything. So if you can remember and note down the details, that could be helpful. You may hear it more clearly, especially if that aircraft is low. If it's helpful, like you can see the scene of the crash and you can stay on scene without being a danger to yourself or others, then you should stay on scene and you should continue to listen. Having heard a Mayday call, it's amazing how it makes the heart beat. So don't jeopardize your own safety to try and follow these rules. But these rules are there if you have the capacity. If you hear a call, a distress call, which is unanswered, then you could relay the message. In red there is the example from CAT 413. And the bit I've put in bold there is trying to emphasize the point that if you're relaying a message, don't introduce any confusion about who the message is talking about. So I have intercepted a Mayday call from, in this case, Golf Bravo Juliet Romeo Delta. So make the Mayday call and make it clear who is the originator of the Mayday call. For completeness, if you hear the cancellation and the cancellation isn't heard by the ground station, then you should also communicate that cancellation. I mentioned earlier in the agenda that there's something called the distress and diversion cell. So this is down at Sonic, staffed by RAF personnel. And the frequency, which we should all know, is 121.5. And they can provide assistance and coordination in emergency cases. And if you speak on that frequency, a system of auto triangulation comes up, and the next slide will show you what I mean by that. But I put on there a link, which if someone reminds me just before I check out, I'll paste that link and one other into the chat for a leaflet issued by D&D, which talks more about their services. So if you talk a 121.5, then provided you're high enough, you buy me many drinks and I'll tell you what happens if you're too low. If you're high enough, you get a 3-line trace. So 3 lines will come together from indicating where you are. In other words, where the lines intersect. And the D&D promise is that so long as you're at 2,000 feet in the area encompassed by the London TMA, they'll find you, and 3,000 feet elsewhere. I did one at exactly 3,000 feet in Lambeda last week, and they were straight on to us. They did ask us to put a squawk in, but I think they would have done that anyway. So I don't know if the squawk helped or not. So this is auto triangulation, just to say that again, if you speak on this frequency, they will know pretty much exactly where you are. And as you've gathered from what I've just said about being at Denby last week, you can practice with them. So you should tune 121.5, make sure your volume's up, as you should do with every frequency, every time you're checking the radio. So make sure the volume's up, and then wait to make sure that a genuine emergency of some sort is not underway. You cannot, say again, cannot practice Mayday, but you can practice urgency, pan, and you can ask for a training fix. So in the right-hand column there, these are the words from CAT 413, practice pan, practice pan, practice pan, London Centre, Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta request, practice pan. Actually, CAT 413 doesn't say request. So give them chance to reply. So last week they replied very quickly, but I was quite surprised. There's often something like a 20-second wait before they come back. So make your transmission and then wait. And they will likely say, Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, London Centre, continue with practice pan. And then you can tell them your story, simulating rough running engine, request diversion to nearest airfield, for instance. And they'll give you a vector to steer. Keep it short though, because it's worth knowing that all commercial airliners, if they've got a spare frequency and spare capacity, they've got 121.5 tuned. So we shouldn't be blocking up the frequency because it might be needed for genuine use, genuine emergency use, I should say. And also, we don't want to annoy professional colleagues all the time listening on a summer's day to endless practice pans. So keep them short, or I actually would say, and what I encouraged my P2 to do last week, training fix, and again, just keep it quick and don't ask for a vector. A training fix then, the history of a training fix, let me just quickly say this, that people, for some reason, and of course I do understand it, are shy to say that they're lost. So to encourage people to practice and perhaps to say, maybe I'm lost, maybe I'm not, you can ask for a training fix. And the way to do it is in black ink there, say training fix 3 times, and your call sign, and then once again, wait. And they'll be working in the background using that auto triangulation to try and plot out where you are. It helps if you have in your mind the sorts of things that they might say back. And these are the things that I've heard. Looking at the bullet points. So they often say squawk 0437 or whatever they give you as a number to help them locate you. They might say transmit for DF. So that means transmit for direction finding because they want to see these lines come together again. And so you'd simply say you're something like Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta transmitting for DF, Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta. That's enough. And they will hopefully get a 3-line trace for you, or if you're a bit lower, a 2-line trace. If you're silly low, it's a 1-line trace, which is not a lot of good. They might ask you to report your heading to try and distinguish you from somebody else. And then when it's all, and they'll say something like, show you 2 miles north of Ruffin. And then they'll say, do you require any further assistance? And then simply negative, pass your call sign. They'll then say, go en route, or squawk conspicuity, go en route, some such thing like that. So that's how you can practice with D&D. We've been talking about emergency transponder codes, and there are really 3 main ones. And it's perhaps, if you find it tricky to remember, I found this useful. 77 going to heaven, this is the emergency one. 76 need a fix, like a radio fix, speaks to radio failure. 75 stay alive, you've been hijacked. Hopefully that's not going to happen in our context. But those are the 3 specific transponders codes that relate to emergencies. And there's one more which I think it's been there a while, but I've only really recently learned about it, which is if you're lost, you can squawk 0030. So if you were lost and you had a transponder, you could put that in and call up on 121.5, and they will already be starting to work out where you are. So these, if it's not obvious, you should know these. You should know what these are. Typical glider scene. This is a thought for you, it's not mandatory, it's just an idea. So you'll have read in S&G a few times, and maybe that sometimes you land in a field and you get the cavalry arrive. Worst thing, you get an air ambulance wasting its time and money coming to you, just because someone's thought that this is an emergency and it's a crisis and they've dialed 999. So I've got the D&D phone number in my phone, and which could be useful anyway, by the way. But if I've landed out, then I call them and I tell them where I am and that I'm fine. And so if anyone does, out of helpfulness, overreact, they might be able to allay people's concerns and tell them that you're fine and you don't trigger all the emergency actions. So Paul, I'll come to you in just a heartbeat. So that's it for questions. So that's it really for the emergency part of this presentation. Paul, might be logical to review any questions that have popped up now.
I don't think we've got anything on the chat at the moment, Chula.
Okay.
You might want to check yours just in case. But if anybody's got any questions, now's a good time.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
What is a typical conversation with the phone number that is indicated as 0148961246406?
I'm awfully sorry, my phone rang. What was the beginning of the question?
What is the typical conversation? Is
simply the times I have called them for a crash. But anyway, leave that aside. The context here is you land in a field, and you might call them and just say, I'm a glider pilot. I've landed in the field. There's no damage. There's no injury. This is my location. This is my glider. This is not an emergency. It's not a crash landing. My friends are coming to get me with a trailer. Just as, okay, that's all that's about. Thank you for clarifying.
So the glider call sign, position, and that you are safe and
Yes.
sound.
Yes. Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So we go on to VHF direction finding.
Oh, sorry, one question
Oh, yeah, go.
from Alicia. Would you relay a pan?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Very clear.
Okay.
Thank you.
And actually, Alicia, thank you for asking that, because one of the things when I was examining, I used to have a tape which I played, and who knows, my coaching group may get it tonight, of a pan call which doesn't get answered. The pilot still needs assistance and is still not getting the assistance he or she needs. So yes, relay that. That's a good question.
Chula,
Sorry. Forgive me 1 moment. So in the exam, a tape may get played, and as if you hear a tape getting played, it may or may not be a mayday or a pan. Pick up your pen and start writing. It'd be really difficult to do in real life, but you do stand a chance in a test, and you ought to take it down. If it's not answered, you ought to relay it to the appropriate authority, probably the frequency you're already talking on. Break. Sorry, the gentleman I overtalked. Go ahead.
Yeah, Chula, thank you. It's not really a flying thing, but just we had a serious incident on the airfield at Nimpsfield at Bristol and Gloucester Gliding Club this summer. And the emergency services were impressing on us the use of what 3 words to give them information about where you were. So it's not really about flying or a flying service, but the emergency service on the ground, and you're on the ground with a problem in the middle of nowhere. Their preference on the people we spoke to on this particular incident was what 3 words.
Okay, got it. Thank you. That's clear, Brian. And I'm not very good on this myself, but we all ought to be able to interrogate our GPS systems as well to make sure we can read the lat and long. But we'll move on.
Good point.
It's a good point.
Chula, one more question.
Yeah.
Charlie, sorry, Charlie, I can't pronounce your surname. If on SafetyCom 135.480, would a D&D call on 121.5 be heard?
No.
I might be missing the point of this question, Charles. But if you're on one frequency, nobody's going to hear you on a different frequency.
No. Come back to us, Charles. If Paul hasn't answered it, come reword, please, and come back. But I think that is the answer. I'm sure that is the answer to the question asked. But I'm grateful for your question, because it does remind me there is confusion between the call signs London Centre and London Information. D&D is London Centre. London Information was being covered in an earlier program, earlier part of this training, and is not about D&D. And I'm not going to attempt to recover it now. Okay, moving on to VHF direction finding. This has limited use these days, but not no use. Limited but not no use. So this is the situation to think about. Here is an aeroplane out there somewhere, and the magnetic direction to steer to the control tower is, on this illustration, 120 degrees. But the pilot doesn't know that. We know that because we've got the slide here. So the pilot is not sure in which direction to fly to get to the station. So the pilot would say this: Cranfield approach, if that's the station that he or she is tuned to, call sign, request QDM, followed by the call sign. QDM then is the magnetic bearing to steer to get to the station. So there is a clever gizmo in the control tower, which might look something like that. So when anyone speaks on that frequency, a QDM, in this case, comes up in the middle of the dial, in the display. So if the pilot says, Cranford approach Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, request QDM, Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, Controller can look at her screen and say, oh, it's 120 degrees. We'll communicate that to the pilot in this form, Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, QDM, 120 degrees, class Bravo. The class Bravo tells you the accuracy, and this is the hint to how many degrees the accuracy range is. Plus or minus 5 degrees is class Bravo. I think you will only ever get a class Bravo, but that's the nature of the reply. So the pilot then knows that he or she steers 120, assuming no wind, then the aeroplane will eventually home to above the control tower. So QDM is the magnetic bearing, and M for magnetic is the way to remember it, or help you remember it, to the station. QDM is the first on that list. There are 3. QDR is the magnetic bearing from the station. There is a diagram coming up, which will make this more visual and hopefully easier. And a QT is the true bearing from the station. QDR, a way to remember that is a radial. Might help. This diagram, I'll leave it up here for a moment, but of course you can see the slides on Paul's website. You can download all the slides, and this is a way to remember them. The 2 of most use to us, I'm going to venture, are QDM. So that's the airplane bottom right of this slide. Notice it's got nothing to do with the heading of the airplane. It is simply saying that the magnetic heading to steer to the station is, in this case, 290. And the other one that's arguably of use for a pilot is a QDR, which is the magnetic radial from the station. And there's another link on the bottom of this slide, which is my prompt to say at the end of this, put these links in the chat, and this will take you to Skyway code, I think it is, and there's more explanation of this if you want to know about it. Not that you need to know more. If you know these things on these slides, that's pretty much all you need to know. This is a picture of a half-mil chart, and you can see the Cranfield ATZ there, and if it's got VDF and a frequency there, what it's saying is that on that frequency, this service I've just described is available. Okay. It can help you it can help you actually if you're a bit uncertain of your position. It can help with your general orientation, and ATC can use it. So I have been asked to transmit for DF in a glider, believe it or not, and it was the controller trying to ascertain which side of the center line I was. Because I said I was going southeast, and the controller wanted to be sure that I was before they released a bit of IFR traffic. So that's VDF. And that's us nearly for the input tonight. So next week, we're going to be talking about the exams, or Paul and perhaps he might recruit somebody, I'm not sure, talking about the FRTOL exams for those who are interested in doing the practical and written exam. There'll be coaching, of course, as usual. So I beg your pardon. Paul will brief you about further coaching available to those amongst you who are going to take the exams. And of course, there'll be more a chance to practice in small groups. And finally, from me on the slides anyway, we're about to go into practice groups. I've produced a number of scenarios from memory 9. This is the first 4 here. I'll just read the first one. So you've departed Sywell 8 minutes ago. Your engine fails. That's your cue to make the call to Sywell information. The controller will play the Sywell 50, assuming it is an AFIS station. And after a while, you as the pilot reading column 2 say your engine's restarted and cancel your emergency call, whichever one it is you've chosen. So that's what the coaching is about. Great. Well, thank you for your attention. And Paul, any questions?
Yeah, we've got a few questions. Okay, Sanjay says, what does endurance mean in the context of the initial emergency call?
So simply how much fuel you've got in minutes left or hours left.
Yeah, so not less relevant to a glider, but
Yeah.
for an airplane.
Yeah.
Anthony asks, is there a reason why the call sign needs to be repeated at the end of a call when you request a QDM, given that this is different to most other radio calls we've learned?
Yeah, so this is an unusual call these days. And so the controller just needs a moment really to reconfigure, possibly look away to where that device is. So you're just putting it on there to give the machine. You don't want the machine to go blank when you've stopped, as it will when you stop talking. So it's just to prolong the call a little bit.
Yeah. You can say more or less anything, but putting a call sign on there is easy.
Yep.
Okay, Michael asks whether an air-ground radio station has QDM, or is it only full air traffic control?
No, it's air traffic control, and not all of them even now, I don't think. So
No.
definitely not an air ground.
Chris Marin points out that the magnetic bearing and the true bearing that you get are useful to steer in zero wind. So you have to allow for wind if you're going to try and get somewhere with them.
Yeah.
Okay.
And can I just add, if you do use it genuinely, then my strong advice is, given that you've already got lost or nearly lost once, turn onto that heading. Don't try and do mental gymnastics. So if you get a QDM of 235 degrees, turn on to 235. Then you can say to yourself, the station I'm calling is there. Thanks, Paul.
Okay. Sergio, I think you answered your own question, so I'll come back to me if you didn't. Simone asks, what's the real life use of a QTE?
I gather it's for navigators plotting with a table in the back of an aeroplane.
Yeah, there's a way of, if you get a QTE from two stations, you can draw lines from those stations and you'll get across, which is where you are. You're not going to be doing that in a glider. If you get lost, go to 121.5 and talk to them and they will sort you out.
Yeah.
This is, what we're teaching you here is stuff you need for the test. It isn't terribly useful in real life for us.
Yeah.
Okay. Matthew asks about links. The links that Chula mentioned are on the website.
Okay.
And I'll try and remember to put something out in an email tomorrow. But you can go look on the website under the other information, it's either under the theory or the other information, I think. But we've got links to the D&D site there.
I did refresh them, Paul. So I'll send them to you, and I will put them in chat as well.
Okay. Sergio, yes, you've got the right chat. Michael, that's fine. Anthony, in what circumstances would a pilot want to use QDR, QTE? Well, QDR if you were trying to fly to the station, QTE if you were trying to draw a line on the map from the station. Joss asks, if we do an emergency call for an engine failure and we get in the engine to restart and cancel our emergency, are we required to land or can we continue our flight?
So I want to quickly make a distinction. This is flying and what we're doing is radio. But that said, let's say you selected the wrong tank. There's nothing wrong with the engine. It was pure, senior moment. So continue the flight. Yeah.
On the other hand, if you're flying an aeroplane, you've got an unexplained engine failure, you might be very wise to get it on the ground early.
Yeah.
It's a judgment you have to make. There's not a rule.
Yeah.
Okay, Judy, you've sent that link out. Thank you very much. Right, that's it from questions, unless there's anybody else.
Just to say, there are two links there. I'm sorry, I haven't got a line between them. One is further information about VDF for those who are interested, and the first one is the D&D link.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Tudor. In which case, we are good to go to breakout groups.